Royal Highnesses, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for a very warm welcome. I must make an admission, this is my first visit to this dynamic country and to Riyadh. And what I've seen in the short time that I've been here has tremendously impressed me. It's good to be here, and I hope to be back to rectify the fact that I only stayed for one day. I would like to address you today on the topic of competitive partnerships within the context of South Africa's transition to non-racial constitutional democracy. At first glance, the term competitive partnerships would appear to be an oxymoron. Surely we would normally think about cooperative partnerships and competitive rivalries. Nevertheless, there is a sense in which we can and do have partnerships with our competitors, and such partnerships can often be beneficial to all the competing partners and to the countries from where they come. South Africa's experience during its transition to non-racial constitutional democracy between 1990 and 1994 provides an illustrative case. However, before I turn to our experience in South Africa, I would like to address the broader concepts of competition on the one hand and cooperation and partnership that is inherent in all partnerships on the other. We have grown up in a world that has been strongly influenced by Charles Darwin's concepts of natural selection and survival of the fittest. The world that Darwin depicts is one of remorseless and deadly competition. In the dog-eat-dog process of his concept of evolution, there seems to be little room for cooperation and partnership, and none at all for compassion. Instead, there is relentless competition in which the weak are driven to the wall of extinction and the strong survive to replicate their genes. During the last century, this thinking gave rise to the doctrine of social Darwinism. In terms of this, stronger nations had an evolutionary mandate to subjugate and even destroy weaker and less competitive peoples. If brutal competition was the mainspring of evolution, that is how the argument went, why should it not also be the dominant element in human affairs? It was in social Darwinism that Nazis found justification for their reprehensible and genocidal policies. In a less extreme form, social Darwinism also provided justification for imperialism, for the assumption of some European countries that they had some natural right to rule over distant and less developed peoples. Social Darwinism was also used by laissez-faire capitalists to justify their efforts to amass wealth at the expense of the weak and the poor. However, social Darwinism rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of human society. Humans have flourished primarily because of the remarkable levels of cooperation that they have been able to develop within their societies. Indeed, the ability of societies to cooperate internally has been their primary advantage in competing externally with others. It was the societies that protected the rights of citizens through the development of strong legal systems that best avoided conflict and assured internal cohesion. It was the societies that limited the arbitrary power of governments that most effectively created the space for flourishing companies and cooperative civil institutions. It was the societies that protected property and created a framework for the functioning of markets that best facilitated economic and commercial cooperation and the accumulation of wealth. Today, if we look at the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, we will note that nearly all of the categories by which competitiveness is measured relate to the efficacy of institutions and mechanisms that promote internal cooperation and that promote partnership. These categories include the effectiveness of institutions that protect private property and assure impartial justice and effective government. It includes the adequacy of transport and communication infrastructure. It includes the efficiency of goods, labor, and financial markets, the adequacy of health services and education, and the levels of technological development, business sophistication, and innovation. Nearly all these categories relate to the efficacy of internal cooperation within countries and are crucial to their ability to compete successfully against other countries. At the same time, none of this distracts from the central role played by healthy competition. Indeed, one of the principal purposes of cooperative institutions is to facilitate and create a framework for fair competition. Competition is the driving force for the production of wealth, the development of technology, and the advancement of science. Societies that concentrate only on cooperation and that discourage competition invariably stagnate. Communist countries that prohibited competition were fundamentally unable to compete successfully against free market economies. Their failure is graphically and conclusively illustrated by comparing the drabness of the old East Germany with the vitality and prosperity of West Germany. The phenomenal success of South Korea with the regimented deprivation of the North, and the ebullient success of Hong Kong and Taiwan compared with the catastrophic performance of Maoist Communist China. However, societies without strong cooperative legal, governmental, and social frameworks in which there is unbounded competition run the risk of collapsing in anarchy and conflict. It is a bit like a nuclear reactor. On the one hand, the reactor cannot produce energy without the uranium fuel of competition. On the other, without the control rods and protective structures of strong cooperative institutions, there will be an uncontrolled meltdown. In summary, competition is essential, but requires strong cooperative institutions. This is why competitive partnerships are essential for successful societies. The problem that confronted my country, South Africa, in the period before 1994 was that there were no cooperative institutions that could accommodate inevitable competition between the various components of our society. Black South Africans were, under apartheid, specifically excluded from participating in common governmental institutions and were marginalized in markets. As a result, there was no framework to contain the dangerously increasing competitive pressures within our society, which led, as we know, to tragic violence and to many deaths. By the end of the 1970s, the National Party government realized that the situation was untenable and that change was essential. My predecessor, President P.W. Botha, understood the need for change, or as he put it, to adapt or die. he embarked on a process of quite far-reaching reforms. By 1980, genuine trade union rights, including the right to strike, had been extended to all South African workers. In 1983, a new constitution made it possible for the colored and Indian minorities to participate in the same constitutional system as whites. And by 1986, more than 100 apartheid laws had been repealed. However, it was no longer a question of dispensing with segregated facilities and allowing interracial sport. More and more, for the African National Congress and for the world, it became a question of power. The demand was for one-man, one-vote elections and a transfer of power to the black majority. My people, the white South Africans, have three concerns in this regard. Firstly, how would it be possible to protect the reasonable rights of minorities in a majority-dominated system? Secondly, how could they be sure that one man, one vote would not lead to the chaos and tyranny that had characterized the decolonization process in so many other parts of Africa? And finally, they were worried about the possibility of a communist takeover. And this was not a question of reds under beds. Throughout the 70s and the 80s, virtually all members of the ANC's National Executive Committee were also members of the South African Communist Party. In essence, ladies and gentlemen, my challenge when I became president in September 1989 was to reach agreement with the representatives of all major political parties, including the African National Congress, on new cooperative institutions. This was necessary to ensure that all South Africans would be able to work together to promote the success of the country and all its people. On the other hand, we would require institutions that would also be able to manage and contain the inevitable competition for power and resources. My main partner in this great competitive venture was Nelson Mandela. I first met Nelson Mandela on the 13th of December 1989, a few months after I became president. We did not discuss any substantive issues and spent most of the time sizing each other up. We both reached the conclusion that we would be able to do business with one another, that we would become competing partners. At my next meeting with him on the 9th of February 1990, we discussed his imminent release scheduled for the 11th of February. He was initially taken aback and insisted that the release would have to be delayed. He said, "It's too soon." He wanted time for the ANC to make the necessary arrangements. I recall saying to him, "Mr. Mandela, you and I will negotiate about many things, but the date of your release is not negotiable. Let us negotiate about the time of the day and where you must be released." In the end, he chose Cape Town. In the years that followed, our relationship was often stormy. We were, after all, leaders of opposing parties that were locked in intense debate on crucial issues that would determine the future of our country. Our relationship was also strained by continuing violence that was perpetrated by shadowy elements on all sides who wanted to sabotage the negotiation process. Nevertheless, we were always able to come together at critical moments to resolve the many crises that arose during the negotiation process. One such moment was the assassination of Chris Hani on 10 April 1993, when Nelson Mandela was able to use his great moral authority to call for calm and to ensure that the negotiations were not derailed. At the end of November, he and I resolved the last 6 issues that were standing in the way of the adoption of a new transitional interim constitution. The next month, a few days after Nelson Mandela and I had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, Parliament adopted a good and balanced interim constitution. 4 months later, we held our first fully inclusive democratic election. Our relationship was quintessentially a competitive partnership. The new constitution that we negotiated created the framework for an inclusive and cooperative society. At the same time, it established political and judicial institutions that would be able to accommodate the competition for power and resources that we knew would inevitably arise within our new society. Our new constitution made provision for the establishment of a state based on the rule of law, in which the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and constitutional principles would be supreme. It made provision for an independent constitutional court that would have the power to overrule any legislative or executive act at any level of government founded to be in conflict with the Constitution or the Bill of Rights.